and welcome to this special legal compliance session run by Kaizen Law Firm. My name is Nihal, Samara. I'm the General Counsel and Legal Director here at Kaizen, and I'd like to welcome you all to today's special legal compliance update. This session was a short notice session, obviously following the recent announcement made today by Premier Daniel Andrews, and focuses specifically on the legal compliance obligations and the new requirements that are essentially coming in and what agencies need to follow between now and mid-October. We are going to cover off the key requirements of what your agencies need to consider, what this means for your agency as well as other items that we will be leading into, particularly looking at what are some of the legal documents that your agency needs to have, or consequential legal documents that your agency needs to have, and more than happy to answer any questions either as we go through today's session and also at the end of the session once we stop this recording. As always, we pay our respects to the elders past and present upon the lands on which we all meet. While this session is being run by webinar, we do pay our respects to the traditional owners accordingly. So with this, I will add that this is going to be a one of 3 legal compliance webinars that we are going to run. This is really to set the background scene around exactly what your agency needs to be aware of. As I've mentioned, some of the key documents that your agency should consider. We've got a bunch of templates as well too that I'll talk you through as well. These are Word type of documents as well that you can start to use and also review for use within your agency. So essentially what we have been notified as of today was that vaccination is required for authorised workers in Victoria. What isn't clear though around this is certain exemptions that do or could apply based on specific either equal employment opportunities and discrimination requirements, and also medical exemptions as well too. So while the focus has been on mandatory notifications and mandatory vaccinations, there is clarity that's still being sought around what does this mean if one or more of your staff have essentially what I'll call legally valid exemptions, and how do you in fact manage that, as well as authorized workers, and we'll look at what the definition is for those, but also what does that mean for provider agencies as well. So we are going to look at the Victorian Premier's announcement, what is an authorised worker as differentiated to an essential worker, and what legal documents will this now cover as well too for your agency. So essentially, as we do with these webinars, we will be providing the suggested recommendations up front around this. This is a fairly succinct session because we want to just make sure that our supported GEMBA 360 agencies are kept up to date where there are significant legal impacts that your agency needs to be across. So essentially, we are going to send out a legal update around all of this, but this specific legal webinar is to actually just cover off some of the core requirements that you need to be aware of. As you can imagine, since the announcement made, there have been a significant volume of phone calls coming through to our law firm just asking questions, and we wanted to essentially address those here. So essentially, what we're suggesting to agencies is to look at the obviously vaccination policies, look at your workplace policies, and I'll come to some of those in a moment as well too, but also looking at things like your vaccination registers for those of agencies that weren't covered off in specific mandatory vaccination requirements previously. And also what we'll suggest is that you look at your organizational risk register and also contracts and supplier agreements, because what's been announced today potentially will also have an effect with your provider agencies or supplier agencies as well too. As I've mentioned, we will unpack those over the next few days, being Monday and Tuesday of next week, in order to jump onto this for you or with you as well too. So essentially, let's have a look at what the new rules are. And let me summarize these down. And yes, we have taken excerpts directly out of the Premier's announcement today. So essentially, in Melbourne and regional Victoria, an authorised worker list anyone on the authorised worker list will require their first COVID-19 vaccine dose by Friday, the 15th of October, in order to continue working on site. They will need to be fully vaccinated by the 26th of November, and obviously the 15th of October deadline will not apply to workers who already have existing requirements under the Chief Health Officer's directions, and this includes groups like construction, freight, healthcare, aged care, and education will still have to comply with previous advice. Now, essentially, one of the questions that agencies have asked us is who are authorised workers and what does this mean for us? This is obviously the link that has been provided around the authorised workers list, but what we have done is essentially re-ranked this list to what you can see here. Now, we have just put in bold some of the agencies that have joined us today already this afternoon around this. And this will cover, I'm going to say more broadly now, not just community health agencies, but also broader agencies such as domestic violence, alcohol and drug programs, chronic condition services, sexual assault units, Aboriginal community controlled organisations, as well as also cultural-based agencies, including migrant resource centres, refugee services, and the likes as well too. Now, part of this was that when we've had a look at some of the policy directives, equally going back a number of months, we did forecast that these changes were essentially, I'll use the word inevitable, or at the very least expected, only because really we're seeing this focus on vulnerable population groups. So we have pulled off the authorised workers list which is accurate as of midday today, and essentially we will forward this document around to you as well too. Obviously we have, since we updated the list, state and emergency services that are also joining us today as well too. So that said, essentially we do have the register of lists for the authorised providers of who is actually included in this. Now, one of the things that we need to look at around this is not just the authorised workers, but also the authorised providers. And one of the areas that your agencies will need to consider is firstly, obviously, the staffing and volunteer personnel that you have, as well as contractors, but also service agreements that you will have with other providers that are also providing services either on your behalf. So we know a lot of agencies, and it's important that you start to think about this as well too. Firstly, you may have agencies that provide services on your behalf, so and they also fall into this authorised providers list. Or alternatively, there may be suppliers of yours as well too. So essentially the net is actually a lot broader rather than just the, I'm going to say, workplace and HR component. I will unpack a few of these items in the next few slides as well too. But really today's session is to sort of show you how broad the net is actually going to be cast for your agency. All of these we will send through. Just a reminder, we will obviously post these all onto your legal notice board as well too, and other resources back into your GembaDocs policies template as well too, if you've given us access to be able to do that as well too. But obviously we will circulate this information onto your notice board and also into your college library as well too, at the very least. Similarly, for a lot of the forms that I will talk about, assessment forms which we've got, we do have checklists which I'll show you as well too, just to make it easier for yourselves to almost go through that we're looking at. and obviously the slides you'll also get as well too. So this is where you will need to also update things like your COVID safe plans as well, which we will be updating this weekend, ready for you to start using on Monday as well. And this will include, just for reference purposes, specific references back to the Victoria roadmap, and specific areas that you yourselves need to be across as well. So in terms of the legal compliance obligations and the legal documents that we are going to cover off, and some of just being careful on how broad this net now is, essentially, if you don't have one, having a look at a mandatory COVID-19 vaccine policy, and essentially the idea here is to establish a policy requiring vaccination against COVID-19 for all employees and also volunteers whose job responsibilities, and you can fill this in yourself as well too. We do have it drafted up so it covers employees, volunteers, contractors within your agency as well too, and also specific references to population groups that your agency may use. Now, as part of this policy document, let me just bring this up for you as well. Here it is. Here, we do have the specific areas that, again, is coming out of the Premier's announcement as well. So things like purpose, scope, whose responsibility is, what the policy scope is, what the procedure is. So things like vaccination requirements that you may want to ask around who evidence of their vaccination, who is covered by it, evidence of their vaccination, what information you want to collect as well too. But importantly also things like exemptions and non-exempt employees, which I will talk about in the next few slides as well. One of the other things that agencies have also asked us on, and I'll just unhighlight this, is around the costs of vaccinations as well. Now that it's been mandated, and we've sort of flagged this some time ago, agencies are actually looking at, well, who should actually pay for this? Is it the staff member? And this includes things like their leave, if they're going to do it during normal work hours, or if they go on the weekend, are they going to get reimbursed by it? So we have started to cover this off, and you can see where it starts to get quite complicated. Throughout the policy document, we have highlighted specific sections of the policy that you may want to consider around this, and what other items you may want to also look at. The other parts that we have also covered off in this for you is exemptions as well too. And we've started to see this already in aged care, residential aged care programs, where people are exempt from medical, held religious beliefs, certain conditions where they are pregnant, and also anti-discrimination obligations as well. And we've started to place those information in. We've also listed it for you around the procedure as well, around vaccination requirements, information. If you are storing your vaccination information or reasons why people are not having it, how that's actually done and where that's also done as well too, as well as proof of vaccination as well too, and how long, more importantly, you're going to keep this information for. So you can actually see there are a lot of things that are actually coming out of today's announcement that isn't just about who is covered, who's in and who's out. It's really around also the operational compliance obligations from an HR perspective of things that you need to look at. And then again, also what we've also added in from a work health and safety point of view, what is the infection control procedures and responsibilities of employees as well too with your agency, and how and behavioural requirements that they also need to follow as well. So it is a fairly detailed policy around that with specific references to policy directives as well. The other parts that it did cover, and I'll just include this in the slides, is around some of the checklists that you might want to consider in terms of how you actually manage this policy as well. The other parts too that now come from this is also staff contracts. And this can cover both current and future contracts of staff as well too. And again, some of the information on If you are requiring them, obviously, to now have the vaccine, what does that then mean? How long are you going to ask them to supply confirmation of that they've had the vaccine? How long are you going to hold on to this information for? Again, if they are exempt employees under current discrimination laws, then or medical exemptions that they might have, how are you going to manage that process as well? Some of the future contracts and clauses that we have drafted for agencies as well too, and we can send specific clauses if that helps, is around making it mandatory for future employment for employees. So essentially where that comes in, you can actually change your contracts to cover future employees as well. Now, the other document that I did want to raise with this group here is around provider arrangements. Now, what do I mean by that? Or service agreements. Now, if we look at, and I'm just going to bring up the directives under the authorized provider and list of authorized providers. So if we go to the, and I'm just referencing back to the authorized workers site, and we can see who is an authorized provider, and this is the same list that I've shown you before. However, just above it lists the authorized providers. And again, this might cover a range of different agencies that you engage with as well, be that as part of your funding and services agreement. You might work in partnership with one or more of these agencies as well too, and you might also provide services on behalf of this authorized providers list as well. Now, what do I mean, and how does this impact on the work that you do? Well, essentially, if you've got agreements in place, then a couple of the changes in contracts that we've already started to do with agencies is looking at your what we call force majeure or pandemic clauses, and also your insurance requirements as well. So where you've got essentially a what I'll call a secondary group of staff or workforce is around these service agreements. Now, under legal context, I call this supply chain for your agency. So what we're looking at doing here is essentially amending contracts to cover for what we call force majeure or pandemics. So essentially, where your agency is now considered to be within this scope for authorized workers and around mandatory vaccinations, you want to make sure that your providers or partner agencies are also covered by this as well. But also the insurance requirements and indemnity is shared across your agency. So these are the two major clauses that we've actually inserted into a number of agencies' agreements already. This is just an example of two parts of it. There are probably other parts that would say we can work with your agency on, and I'm getting quite a few questions coming through. Yes, we can work with you on this. We can actually provide if it helps, a checklist around some of the contracts that you should be looking at. I'll call it, and I don't like to use the word tier one contracts, but let's use tranche one contracts if that's a better word around it. So first tranche, second tranche kind of groups, maybe a better word around this. So we're looking at things like partnership agreements, service arrangements, supply chain agreements, those type of arrangements that you have with your service groups, because these are some of the two things that you'll absolutely need to consider. And we're going to look at these throughout the next few days on Monday, Tuesday, even next week. So essentially there is the requirement around insurance, and the idea is that if they have staff, that you want to make sure that they're providing services that are safe and effective. And in the event that it does get locked down again in your area, we're seeing this in regional areas like Gippsland. We're doing work in Buchan as well too. And again, we can see some of these arrangements and challenges being coming through at the moment. So again, having those service agreements, if you work with NDIS providers as well too, again, we've done these sorts of works with other agencies, and I cannot stress how important this part of the works actually are as well. Now, one of the other things that is being raised through phone calls today, and I just wanted to cover these off. We will give you more information on this over the next few days. Essentially, we've got a mandatory direction coming from the Premier of Victoria. What hasn't been very clearly set out is what is the exemptions around this and how do you actually manage your workforce where exemptions may apply. Now, one of the things I want to cover off just very briefly here, but it's important, is that there are a range of the Equal Opportunity Act provides a range of protected characteristics. Now, one of the protected characteristics is around political belief or activity. Under the protected attribute for political belief or activity, it makes it unlawful to discriminate against someone because of their political belief or activity, and many in the community still consider that their views on vaccinations to be a political view. However, what we have seen from the Victorian Human Rights Commissioner has made a very clear and public statement that the protected attribute of a political belief or activity is unlikely to apply to a person who is opposed to vaccines being imposed by what we'll call their employer, private sector employer, or service provider. And they've very clearly stated that this is because the requirement is being imposed by an organisation that doesn't represent the government. Now, people might argue around this and say, okay, but your agency isn't a private provider. They might come up with all these other directives that essentially state that you are being forced by the government to act on their behalf and the likes around this. But essentially, the current legal position under the Victorian Human Rights Commissioner is that the idea of a political belief or activity does not cover the reason to not have the vaccine. Now, that said, there is the part of it that there are certain protected characteristics, and that is for a valid medical reason, for a disability, if people are pregnant, or if they have another religious belief as well too. So essentially what agencies have done in this space is, in the event that there are exemptions, they have asked people for evidence of this, and that is covered in our test sample policy document for you. We will also look at what happens if an employee refuses to be vaccinated as well too. We will look at also, can you ask for evidence on whether if people have been refused and why, and how do you manage that process as well too. In the past webinars, we have also covered off, can an employee refuse to attend the workplace because a co-worker isn't vaccinated against the coronavirus? And this is where I'll be quite clear about this. A directive coming from the state government also needs to be read together with regulatory positions by Fair Work and the Equal Employment Commissioner as well too, or the Human Rights Commissioner. So when directives are provided, we also now need to look at a number of other regulator positions, one absolutely being Fair Work, the other one being the Human Rights Commissioner, and of course, Safe Work as well too. Let's be quite clear that off the back of this week, we have seen Safe Work issuing charges against the state government. When I say state government, the Department of Health, around the hotel quarantine. So what we want to make sure is that your agency is covered from a compliance point of view, and you've ticked all the boxes around this and just stepping through exactly where you need to be and when, and not either moving too far ahead or essentially not falling behind around this. One of the most important things that we've seen from Safe Work regulatory point of view is having your agency be able to manage this side of what we'll call the operational compliance side easily and effectively, without just having essentially taking the Premier's approach of mandatory, that's it, that we're not going to do, and then essentially yourselves having non-compliance issues against by Fair Work or Human Rights Commissioner or Safe Work because of some other subsequent issue that comes out of it as well too. So we will cover off around disciplinary action if employees refuse to get vaccinated and how you can do that. We will actually be creating the flow chart around this, but essentially for those of you that have joined us legal webinars over the past few months now, we have covered these off, and we've actually got the templates that we've used in aged care and hotel quarantine arrangements as well. But essentially, this is part of the policy that we'll also send out to you. And of course, how this covers off with anti-discrimination laws as well. I will add, one of the most important things that your staff can continue to do is actually use what we call the daily attestation registers. Many of you will actually have already seen these. I know, for example, a number of agencies where staff work intermittently, and I'll do a bit of a shout out to Lena Tompkinson out at Women's Housing as well too. Women's Housing have moved it from daily to weekly, depending on how staff actually work as well too. So there are a range of areas. This will come in when you look at the work health and safety obligations and actually screening staff. We also know that agencies like the Southern Migrant Resource Centre as well too, and the great work that Trish Matthews has done out there, along with Charles Pern, specifically in setting up the staffing and outreach workers to attest the screenings. Where we've seen this work really, really well in other agencies like Rambalara Aboriginal agencies in Shepparton, for example, that has gone through multiple hotspot rollouts and lockdowns and the like, is that very quickly they're able to identify any issues that they've got with staff, run their reports, but then equally manage any work health and safety compliance obligations. And this is where what we're going to talk about with mandatory vaccinations work in the compliance space is going to come important, because you're going to need to look at, specifically from a policy point of view, your work health and safety obligations around this space as well too. So the suggested recommendations that we're looking at around this is to look at your workplace policies, look at your vaccination policies for your agency. I can see we've got a number of questions coming up, which I will get to. Start looking at your contracts and supplier agreements, specifically around the provider arrangements, because that's where we're going to focus on. We will send out a checklist, which a few people have asked, and also look at your organizational risk register for each of the topics that we have within this slide. Next week on Monday and Tuesday, we're not mucking around. I'm going to say with this, we're turning this around really quickly, and we are going to be doing some work this weekend, specifically around some of the checklist tools to help your agency out around this. We'll be around essentially going through some of these areas of what you need to look at. Next week, we're going to be focusing on service agreements, the operational compliance obligations around managing staff, volunteer, and clients. If there are any questions, we will certainly get to those now around this. If you are watching this webinar after today's live session, by all means, reach out to us on 1300 360 360, or you can email us at support@gemba360.com.